So to begin the workshop, I am honored to introduce our distinguished panelists. Each of our guests will speak for a few minutes about their careers and experiences in national security, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So definitely be thinking of your questions. First to my right is Dr. Rana Sweet Ann Bowden, a distinguished scholar at the Clements Center, an adjunct assistant professor at UT, and a consultant for a number of NGOs focused on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in Asia. She previously served at the State Department in a number of offices, but most recently in the Department of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Next to her is Dr. Aaron O'Connell. He teaches at the Department of History and is a faculty fellow here at the Clements Center. He's previously served at the National Security Council as Director of Defense Policy and Strategy, and is a 22-year veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. And finally, we have Carolyn Espinoza. She currently serves as the Deputy Director, Right on Crime at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. She comes to Austin after spending nearly a decade on Capitol Hill, and most recently served at the State Department on the policy planning staff. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for that introduction. So aside from my time, as Jennifer mentioned, one of my last jobs at the State Department was working in the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And some of the other things I did at the State Department included, well, my first job was actually doing intelligence analysis. That was my first job coming out of my master's degree at Stanford. And that was a very interesting job at a time where things were very tense, as they, again, are now with the relationship between China and the U.S. And then from there, I spent some time at the U.S. consulate in Shanghai, and I also spent some time on the China desk. For a number of reasons, I was drawn to working on human rights and rule of law, and so that was the final job I had at the State Department before pursuing my PhD, which I did at Oxford University. So I'm also going to take a little bit of license. The title is How to Land an Internship, but I'm going to go a little beyond that and talk also about how to be successful in your internship. And Jennifer was too polite to mention it, but I'm also married to the director of the Clements Center, Ann Bowden, and he happened to see my notes for the talk on our printer this morning, and he approved them, so I think it's okay if I go beyond the title of this talk. I also work part-time here as an adjunct at the LBJ school, and so Will is also with our 3-year-old. He's the main reason I work part-time, so he's done several things to make sure that I could be here to speak with you, which I'm very happy about. So I'm going to offer you 9 big principles, both on how to land an internship and be successful. So the first one, and I'm just going to jump right in, and I'll be happy to take questions later on. But the first one I would say is be focused on others and be selfless. So what do I mean by that? In your cover letter, do not talk too much about yourself and how this internship will help you achieve your career aspirations and dreams. That's okay to mention maybe once, but focus more instead on how you are going to serve that organization, how you have skills that will help the people there, and how you would be a good fit for that organization. Because the people who are looking at those those letters are usually at organizations that don't have enough resources. They're really stressed and tired, and they want somebody who's going to be enthusiastic and bring in a lot of good skills, relevant skills, whether they're language skills or computer skills. So consider it from their vantage point. So don't be too self-referential. I would also say that once you are working probably in Washington, D.C., where the professional world is filled with ambitious people who are very focused on themselves, I actually think the interns and people I've worked with who stand out most to me are the ones who didn't focus so much on themselves and their own career ambitions. The ones who stood out to me were the ones who took even menial tasks and jumped right in, or once they finished their work, were willing to do additional things or ask their colleagues or supervisors what more they could do. So the second point I would make is to also be strategic and have a long-term vision. So what this means is landing a good internship begins before you even start writing your cover letter. It means gaining the right kinds of skills and experiences so that you stand out. And what does that look like in the field of foreign policy and national security? Study abroad, language skills, part-time internships, volunteering, clubs, and yes, I'm sorry, your GPA really matters. So do different kinds of computer skills. I once needed an intern who could make different kinds of maps showing inequality or showing human rights abuses. So kind of think creatively about the different kinds of skills that will make you more marketable. This long-term vision also applies to your work, and having this long-term vision will really pay dividends. So as I mentioned, be willing to pick up even relatively menial tasks, because eventually what that means is if you do a good job with the simple tasks that aren't so exciting, you're going to get more responsibility and more interesting work. I would also say that you should do your research and study the organization and know the lay of the land. So you probably know the different main actors, the State Department, Congress, think tanks, different NGOs. But research the different areas that you're most interested in. You know, for example, Treasury Department also plays a big role in foreign policy. The Department of Labor also has an international labor program in a number of different countries. And if you're interested in a very particular field like nuclear security or democracy building, get to know the major players within that field. There are a number of different NGOs, 4 or 5 that in Washington that are considered the main players on democracy building. So if you're looking to do that type of work, focus your attention there. There are other NGOs that you could still do interesting work, but at least understand how they fit into the great scheme of whichever field within international relations you be in. And if you don't know, do research. Go to their websites, read, do informational interviews, look at their most recent publications, ask people, ask your professors. This will also help you, being informed will also help you in 2 critical things that are related to landing your internship. Writing a really good cover letter and asking informed questions. And I'll get more to the cover letter in a minute. This will also help you work well in organizations where you eventually land the job, because you will then understand what is that organization's mission, how do they see themselves as being different from other organizations in Washington, and so you will then be able to support your supervisor and the organization's overall goals and mission better. I would also say learn to write clearly and communicate concisely. So the people who are looking at the application, so for example, when I was at the State Department, we literally got maybe 100, maybe more applications, kind of like that. And you know, as the other speakers will tell you, a lot of these Washington jobs, you're in the office like 10 to 12 hours a day. So how do you start looking at those applications? I'll be honest, the first cut, I would just go through and look at GPA and school. And the ones that didn't, and I would just cast a bunch on the side. The second cut would then be, okay, I'm actually gonna look at the cover letter a little bit, and I'm gonna look at the resume a little more carefully. And the ones that conveyed something interesting in their cover letter where they understood what the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor did at the State Department definitely stood out. And then even more important, no mistakes, no typos, no grammar errors, correct titles, correct the name of the Bureau, Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. There's 1 comma, not 2. So pay attention to those little details. And that is important because the people who are looking at those resumes are usually overworked and kind of tired. And they're looking at those thinking, is this somebody that I can trust them with taking on some important tasks to help me, to help the organization. So those are just some things that you should keep in mind. I would also say show initiative, but not too much. So for example, if you've gotten an interview, follow up with a thank you note and reiterate your interest, but don't keep pestering them or pursuing them. And then at work, when you're assigned different projects, do it and do it well, but and follow up, but sometimes there's too much initiative. So for example, when I was at the National Democratic Institute for Democracy, we had a China program, and as you know, human rights and democracy is kind of sensitive in China. And so we were pretty careful about how we updated the website and things like that. And so I had an intern who said, oh, we've had some new activities in China. I went ahead and wrote a new description of the China program. Now, thankfully, she didn't hit the publish button or anything like that. But, and I was thankful that she showed that initiative, but it was a little too much. She may have instead just asked, hey, do you want that website updated? We needed to be careful how we presented our program, and we also needed to be careful, we also didn't want it to be the kind of description where we had to update it every 3 months. We wanted it to be something that could stand for a year to 18 months before we had to look at it again. So that's another thing. One thread that has come out, I think, is, and I'll reiterate it because it's so important, pay attention to details and menial things. Don't get titles wrong and things like that. Also, I know you're probably blast emailing or blast cover letter. Double check it, because you don't want to send, and I have seen this, cover letters addressed to us, but it has the wrong name of the person or the wrong bureau in the State Department, and people notice this. I mean, that actually makes it easier because that application is put on the side as no, we're not following up. It also translates into your work. So for example, I was in a job where we were hosting a strategy lunch. And so I asked the interns to be in charge of ordering the food and just setting up the lunch. And they set the tables with china that our organization had kept around for that type of thing. So I walked in the room and I thought, wow, this is nicer than I even thought it would be. So, and that type of detail, I mean, it's been many years, and I still remember what a good job they did, and it made me more inclined to trust them with other kinds of work and want to give them more challenging experiences and mentor them. Similarly, a couple of years ago, I was one of the readers for a senior thesis, and the thesis, there were some small parts of the argument I didn't completely agree with, but it was very well argued. It was perfectly footnoted. I don't remember seeing a mistake. And so after I was a reader, an opportunity came up for me to do a consulting project for Human Rights Watch. And I knew I couldn't do the project on my own. And I knew this student was graduating, so I asked her, would you like to be an unpaid intern? And she was very interested in the field of human rights, so she said, yes, I would love to. And so doing a great job on her senior thesis landed her an unpaid internship with one of the premier human rights organizations. And then she did an amazing job on the project. For that project, I probably had to do at least 50 interviews. She had to transcribe well over half of them. That probably took 150 hours of her time unpaid. And again, she did it excellently, well organized, no typos, no mistakes. And so later in the project, which actually dragged on for more than a summer, I think she worked on it for about 6 or 7 months, I actually went and advocated for her to Human Rights Watch and got her a stipend of several $1,000s to help compensate for her time. So these types of things people will notice, and it'll really make you stand out. I would also say that you should follow up some thank yous to people after they interview you. if you've had a good experience with someone interning for them, send them a thank you. Also, if you finish an internship and you really found the people and organization interesting, stay in touch in appropriate ways, emails, things like that. And at work, also follow up on tasks. Once you're done with it, ask your boss, did I do that well? What more do you need on that? And then finally, I would say, don't be too chummy. I'm a pretty down-to-earth person, but don't call me Rana. Call me Dr. Ann Bowden. I see that in a lot of letters or emails. Hey, Kate. That's another colleague, and she was like, why do they think they should call me Kate? So I would say be as referential and respectful as you can, and then only if the person says, hey, you can call me by my first name, which, for example, my Oxford professor preferred, then you can do that. But otherwise, just usually in life, choose the most respectful way to address a person. And then I would say that also applies to when you're at work. Don't be too chummy, meaning don't talk too much about the crazy things you do on the weekend. Be appropriately friendly and sociable, but not too chummy, and have a sense of professional etiquette. So I'll stop there and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
All right, I have never been an intern in my life, so I'm the perfect person to be on this panel right now. I have hired a few interns at times, and most of my experience has been in uniform, so either military or working at an embassy overseas, or working in the State Department or the National Security Council, which is mostly not military. So I think I have a grasp of the professional culture of the DC national security community. So I guess I will give you some broad themes that will be useful as you pursue a career, whether it's at the internship phase or beyond, in both understanding the strange tribe that is the DC national security community with its various sub-tribes, which all have their own kind of levels of this is the right amount of formal, these are the right titles, and they're all a little different. But I think there's some general things that apply. First, both to echo what Dr. Ann Bowden said.
You're allowed to call me Rana.
Oh, good, okay. The single one thing, if you can only do one thing and you want to improve your chances at having a fantastic career in national security, or frankly in almost anything else, work on your written and oral communication skills constantly, forever. Never stop. Becoming more precise and more eloquent and more nuanced in your speech and in your written communication, and being able to adapt that to all sorts of various forms, whether it's a short email to somebody incredibly important, or a long explanation about why you really care about what you do when you're trying to get a job. This means reading all the time. You don't have to only read the great works of literature, but you should be reading constantly, and reading in a way different than you read when you read Harry Potter. There, you're purely in an absorption mode of reading something you're enjoying and just being told a story through your reading the words. No, you need to actually diagnose good writing as you read it. You have to say, why was that so effective? Oh my God, that's 4 sentences, and look at what he did. Look how complicated that idea was. And then try to mimic and improve your own. The more you do this, the more people will certainly not throw you out in the first half of the pile, because even though there's not a single grammatical error, it's just arduous to read. And that's a great way to get rid of an application. It will not only cause you to rise to the top, but then you will get this kind of muscle training that you work on your whole career, particularly in interviews or in the moments when the pressure's on and you have to either ask an incisive question or explain something or summarize something succinctly. If you do that well, everyone notices. That is an escalator towards a better career. What are some other escalators? Frankly, there are some kind of old, medieval style rules to the DC national security, what makes you prestigious community. So having an advanced degree from about 5 or 6 schools will almost certainly matter more than others generally, but not specifically. Ivy League schools, absolutely. Oxford and Cambridge in England, absolutely. A master's or a PhD from those schools is you jump right into a whole different community of what kind of jobs you can get. But not if it's a certain specialty. So if what they're specifically hiring is a Central Asia expert, it doesn't matter if you went to Yale. They don't have a Central Asia historian there anymore. They don't do that kind of stuff. And that can be a state school. It can be a small, a private university. The point is, You do need to develop an expertise, but one of the quick escalators is if you can get to those sort of top schools, yeah, I'd say go get a master's from one of them. It will definitely help you. Another escalator that just immediately puts you into another category of sort of jumping in at level 10 of the job availability in DC is the President Management Fellows Programs, PMFs, which you apply for, and if you get it, it's 2 years, I think, where you rotate through various parts of the federal government. It always results in an offer, but PMFs are such high quality that they often end up working in the Undersecretary's office of Undersecretary of Defense, on the Joint Staff and having contact with the chairman of the Joint Staff. So it's a prestigious fellowship that then allows you to enter into a middle level in government for state, treasury, not things like CIA, obviously not the military. You could be a DoD civilian, but you don't jump into uniform. Relatedly, there are certain fellowships people can get coming out of undergraduate that are absolutely those giant escalators. So if you are one of these people that has an incredibly competitive GPA and are well-rounded and are really kind of always trying to have the perfect resume, yeah, try to get Marshalls, Fulbrights, Rhodes, Watsons, all the various, there's a lot of them, I don't know all of them, but those things jump you up a level very quickly. You definitely need to develop a core expertise, which in the beginning will be kind of silly. Your claim to it will be, I studied abroad for 1 semester. Does that help? Yes. Does that mean you know anything really about how to run policy in that country? They know you don't, but it's something, right? But in the first 3 years, yeah, there should be a consistency of saying, look, I can do things you need. And that often, one way to correlate consistency, a language skill with experience in the country, with knowledge of the issues that are important to the US relationship with that country. That's a nice, okay, they're already skilled in this area. Languages in the foreign policy community, quite important. They are quite important. And some of the harder ones or difficult ones are real door openers for you because they don't always have it, somebody who speaks Kazakh, and sometimes they need them. Find mentors and help your peers. And I don't mean this just as an intern, I mean throughout, your early career. A great deal of what gets people hired or liked or favored or deemed valuable in a team has as much to do with the basic good person you are or are not, and how you interact with your peers. If you are constantly striving to be useful, you're constantly developing a sense of commitment to what you do, and it's clear that you are a hard worker, then people naturally will like you, and that helps a great deal. That's not enough, though. I mean, mentors are incredibly important, and here I'm sorry to say that the mentoring infrastructure in place in Washington, D.C. right now is still far too set up for white dudes who look like me, and not people of color, and certainly not women. It's still, it's undervalued, it's poorly structured. Because particularly in military, national security, defense, CIA, FBI, those are still predominantly male-dominated organizations. And even if they've changed the composition at the entry level or the mid-level, there aren't 4-star general equivalents who are women, who then notice an incredibly smart and capable young woman or man and take them on as a mentor. So what that means is it's easier for men to find mentors because they're familiar with the gender. It's doubly easy if it's white men because they're more likely to be white men. And that's an unfair structural disadvantage you have to think through, how to still find mentors and get people who are farther along in the career that kind of say, oh wow, you're here, well what do you want to do here? I mean, mentors are really important. Finally, and this comes from the military, but I think it applies outside the military as well. One way that people find young people in the workforce inspiring is that they have both the energy and the kind of commitment to do a job well, and then also a strong sense of this work is important, and I feel a sense of value by being involved in it. Quite literally, you are batteries for old bureaucrats who are like, oh geez, I've been doing this for 25 years. And young, inspired people, enthusiastic people, that's a wonderful characteristic to have. So this is really a guide for you on how to pick the internship that matters or the job that matters. If you don't see aspects of it that make you really enthusiastic, whether not the immediate work you're in, but the organization you're in, its mission, its purpose, if you don't look at it and go, man, in 3 years I might have this, that would be amazing, move on. Because if you can't fake it, the little annoying parts of being an entry-level person in the DC bureaucracy will eat you alive, and you'll be like, what the heck am I doing? This sucks. So you have to really care about the organization you're working for, or the goal, the strategic 5 to 10 year plan you've set out for yourself. And if you can stay inspired by that, that's an excellent escalator through the bureaucracy of the system. That's all I've had.
Well, I actually have had an internship, but it was just one. It was when I was 16. I was homeschooled, and my mom decided we needed something to bolster our college applications, and so she somehow figured this out and dragged us to this interview, and I was a sullen 16-year-old going, what am I doing here? I ended up doing the internship, and it kind of jump-started my career. It's because of that, and I did put aside my sullenness, and I was faithful in the little things, and did what I was asked, and did it with enthusiasm, and I ended up learning a lot. And so when I was in college and decided, oh, I do need an internship now, and I want one in the foreign policy arena, and I went back to the place that I'd interned when I was 16, and they helped me not get an internship, but I ended up getting my first job while in college with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which was a pretty cool experience. So even if it's not exactly what you wanted to do, it can be helpful, particularly if you're starting quite early. So I'm going to step back and kind of walk through the steps of how to get that internship, and then how to turn that into something else. So I think the first thing you need to figure out is where. Do you have the means to go to DC? Do you need something that's paid? Or is it something that you can do here? Because there are opportunities here in Austin where you can do paid or unpaid internships, part-time internships that you can do while you're in class, which actually would be helpful when you're then looking for something else in DC because you have experience. And then there's government. Do you want to do nonprofit or NGOs? And with NGOs, you have both nonprofits and for-profit. There are a ton of contractors that deal in all of this that you can work for, and sometimes those will be they'll provide a little bit more. Another thing to consider is type. I think a lot of people think immediately policy. But I'm actually a communications person. I didn't actually intend to go into it, but it's what I was good at. It's something that I went on to do. Most of my time on the Hill was spent as a press secretary. When I was at the State Department, I was in policy planning, but I did communications, strategic communications for the secretary. So think about that. So there's policy. There's also advocacy. So I think a lot of people, particularly if you're interested in human rights, sometimes it's not just making the policies, but advocating for the right policies and influencing the policy makers. So those are all, and a lot of places have different types of internships in that sense, where it's like you can go into the comm shop, you can go into the policy shop. So those are things that you would want to think about. And I think both of you touched on this, is do your research, not just for the types of internships and types of organizations that you can go to, but once you kind of narrow it down, figure out who works there, figure out what issues they're dealing with, become knowledgeable. Those are things that are going to help you. Ask for informational interviews. Subscribe to their listservs. Start getting those emails, reading through them, seeing what's there. And a lot of times they'll clue you into some of the things that they offer, be it internships or short-term fellowships. A lot of organizations will offer educational fellowships. I think Hertog is one, Claremont's another, where they'll give you scholarships to go to New York and take some classes on specific issues. So those are things that you can do that are short-term, particularly if you don't have a whole summer to dedicate or a whole semester to dedicate to an internship. So then the question is, how do I make myself stand out? How do I get them to look at my resume, my cover letter when they have a whole stack? Rana pointed out very astutely that the people looking at these are overworked, they're tired, they're looking at all sorts of things. So I think the very first thing that I would recommend is follow instructions. If something, I actually got a job, an interview for a job that I ended up getting because I did not write a cover letter. The instructions said, do not send a cover letter, which made me very happy. And I was later told by my boss at the time that he was shocked at how many people sent cover letters, and it was just a very simple instruction that should have made your life easier. So follow instructions, particularly for the government jobs, because there you really have to check the boxes. If you don't do that, they'll just throw it right out. Rana, I think, covered a lot of the, don't make errors. And for your cover letter, you want to personalize it, but she's right in that you don't want to talk too much about yourself, but try to tell a story. Draw connections as to why you want to work at this place and how you can benefit them. I mean, not everybody has a story, but you can weave things in. I read one cover letter for somebody who wanted to work in economics, actually, and he was telling the story about how a company in his hometown closed and a lot of people lost jobs and it was difficult, but he made the connection from that to our foreign relations and building economic partnerships abroad, and that's why he wanted to work there. And that's something that's memorable, because anybody can Google how to write a good cover letter and just sort of do that form letter, and we've all seen way too many of those. Another thing that people like to do, which can be good or bad, is on their resume put down their hobbies, because you don't have a lot of experience at this point. That can be good if they're real hobbies. I've actually known people who've gotten internships because they were really good softball players, and that office needed some ringers for the summer. So if it's an actual hobby and you are good at it, and you'd like to share that, go ahead. But don't put things like reading. Because A, that's not a hobby. B, you should be doing that anyway without you're telling me that you do that as a hobby, and that makes you a lot less interesting if that's your hobby. So just be careful about that. I read one cover letter where a prospective intern was saying how he liked to find ways to challenge himself mentally and physically. And then in parentheses said, though I haven't been to the gym in a while. So his attempt at humor basically told me that he liked to find ways to challenge himself and then not do that. Not something that I'm looking for in an intern. So, you get there, and you get the internship. So how do you turn this into a job? How do you make this work for you? I think the first thing is, while you're in there to get experience, don't have the attitude that whoever you're working for is serving you. That's not the way it is. A lot of people come into internships and say, well, I'm here to get experience. What can you do for me? It's the other way around. Particularly in DC, you've got overworked, overtired people who don't have a lot of time. They're looking for someone who can take work off of their plates, not somebody who's going to create more work. How many of you have heard of completed staff work? Completed staff work is the principle that when you turn something in, when you're asked to do something, what you turn in, your superior just needs to look at it and can either approve it or deny it. You're not creating more work for them. That's actually a principle that Secretary Tillerson's office, that's what they looked for in people. I do a little bit more research, learn a little bit more about it, but it's something I think that is applicable not just in an internship, but for the rest of your life. If you're going to do something, do it to the best of your ability. Something that I tell my kids a lot is, there is such a thing as a stupid question. Your teachers may have told you the opposite all of your life, but a stupid question is one that you haven't tried to answer yourself, that you haven't asked yourself. So if I've asked you to do something, I don't want you to come back with, how do I do that? Or what do you want me to do? Think about it first and say, how would she want me to do that? How would I, if I were in her shoes, what kind of work product would I want? And that directs your question so that it's not a stupid question. So then you're asking, is this the way to do it? Is it better if I do this or this? And also then you don't look like an idiot either. So those are little things that I've always looked for. Another thing is be on time, be present. You'd be amazed at how many people, I think particularly in unpaid internships, are, well, I'm not getting paid for this, so they're late. They disappear, they take long lunches. You know, you don't need to work yourself to death, but be present. And be present mentally too. Don't just, you know, hide at your desk. You want to interact, but you don't want to waste people's time. And you can do that with asking too many questions as well. But at the same time, this is your opportunity to make connections, to get to know people, and for them to get to know you. The number one way you do that is by the type of work that you do. That is always what people will judge you on moving forward in jobs. But also have a good attitude, be cheerful. You know, don't be a Debbie Downer. I have both fired interns and hired interns for jobs because they've done a good job. Firing interns, it's happened twice, and both occasions actually have been because of lying. And that's just, you know, they screwed up. One screwed up and then tried to lie to cover it, and then one just lied. Not sure why. But you know, you're young. Even when you're older, like I am, you will continue to screw up, but you got to own up to it. And that's something that's important because you own up to it, you learn from it, and you move forward. The interns that I have hired, I didn't hire them because they necessarily were experts in something or were even very good at the subject matter. I judged them on their progress, where they started and where they ended. How much did you learn? How much did you develop yourself? Did you take advantage of what was provided to you and do something with it? So that's kind of how I've always judged people. Is you're you're in college. A lot of you you don't have much more than a good GPA. Sometimes it's volunteer work, and so you're not expected to be a subject matter expert yet for your first internship, particularly if you're an undergrad. But let's see what you do with that. Let's see what you do with the opportunity that you've been given. I know that both of you kind of touched on skills. Basic skills like PowerPoint, Excel, being able to do Photoshop, graphics, and of course it goes without saying, writing and communicating. Those are all, writing and communicating, essential. The other ones are exceedingly helpful because when you get into an office with, particularly with some of your older colleagues, they don't like to do graphics. They're not going to do Photoshop. But if you can, you've just taken a lot of work off of their plate. It's also a way for you to show creativity, and that's where you can put ideas in. Because yes, I think as Rana said, you want to have ideas and be creative and be innovative, but you can't reinvent the wheel because sometimes reinventing the wheel means more work for the person you're working. And I think that I've just word vomited everything that I had to say, so happy to take any questions.
So you mentioned not including hobbies on your resume unless it's like necessary. Would you say the same thing about including a blog on your resume?
If it's a good writing sample,
Okay.
I think that's perfectly acceptable. And I wouldn't even say with hobbies, not necessarily necessary, but just if it's a real hobby, because you do want to personalize it. When you don't have a lot of experience, and I'm just looking at papers after resume after resume after resume, what is going to make you stand out? I mean, I had a colleague who was an alternate Olympic swimmer, so putting that on a resume, it was like, that's interesting, and now you do foreign policy. So, putting interesting things about yourself can be a benefit. But again, don't put reading.
It's also just about, getting the joke right? So making a joke about I haven't been to the gym is dumb, but somebody saying, and if nothing else, I'm a really good softball player and I'm not at all above coming in to be the ringer for your team. This is an internship and I am a starving artist. That might work, that might rise, that might fall, because absolutely something that makes someone chuckle or even just go, wow, you just rose, that's the one they remember for the next 50 they read. So it matters. So they can say, oh, we're not going to take the Olympic guy, come on, you know? When they start fighting over an intern, these little things can matter, but it's whether your joke works, right? I have definitely put jokes in resumes. It's risky.
And I think it depends on the person reading the resume too. I mean, it's a gamble,
Yeah,
but you know, risks have rewards, and so really, kind of, how risky are you?
Yes.
So this one might be a little specific, but my father always tells me don't address cover letters like to whom it may concern.
Correct.
What do you do if you don't know the person's name or title? Like, who do you address it to?
This is where doing your research comes in. So if it's not on the website, you can pick up the phone, ask.
But if you're talking about like basically cold calling, throwing resumes in when there hasn't been a specific invitation, because when it's an invitation, then it's an organization, and then you say, you know, dear members, I guess you could say what, members of the selection committee or something, and, you know, but
Okay.
yeah, if you're just like throwing it out there, you better find the name of the specific office you're applying to, and I guess you'd say to the members of X office, or whatever the title of the office is.
I do agree with not to whom it should.
Yeah, don't have it right
Would concern. It's weird, some of the DC organizations try to make it impersonal because they don't provide the name of the person. You might then use, and I don't like this because I think it's actually it's not logical, but put in the name of the organization. Or you could go and look at the organization's website and figure out who is in charge of the internship program or who is in charge of human rights or human resources. And then that could be a starting point, but your dad gives you good advice.
He hires people for a living. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes, ma'am, over there, and then.
I was wondering how necessary it is to get a PhD in order to get a career in foreign policy.
Can you say that again?
Do you need a PhD to have a career in foreign policy? No, you don't need a PhD to have a career in foreign policy.
I don't have one.
Yeah. It helps in certain contexts, right? It puts you into a a certain set of job tracks, and that will matter in your 40s. You know, there's a point at which you can keep advancing if they can call you a doctor in certain parts, but that's more, but also can be about your expertise. So it's not so much that it's a PhD, but it's that you really, really, really know about Central Asian energy. So that can, but it doesn't have to be a PhD, it has to be just a way that you've credibly demonstrated expertise.
I'm going to give you a slightly nuanced answer. First, no. Most of my career working at the State Department, actually all of my career working at the State Department, I did not have a PhD. And you will meet a lot of very successful people working in foreign policy. Most of the people working in foreign policy actually won't have PhDs. That said, I do think it can be helpful in certain circumstances. As Dr. O'Connell said, showing a certain level of expertise in a very particular field can be helpful. Certain organizations, like, for example, at the Department of State, there's an office called Policy Planning. Policy Planning is kind of the State Department's inside think tank, and they report directly to the Secretary of State. Almost everybody in that office has a PhD, but that's because they're trying to do long-term thinking instead of just reacting to world events. So sometimes it can matter, but not all the time. And then just on a very personal level, I'll say that I think I had a very good and interesting career at the State Department, and actually my last job there in the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, I thought this is my dream job, aside from being able to work on various human rights cases and what the President or Secretary of State was saying about human rights publicly and in high-level meetings. I got to weigh in on those things. And Congress had also given us an earmark for $20 million. So lots of really interesting things I got to do. I didn't have a PhD, and I was enjoying it, and I think I was doing pretty well at it. But I will also say that as a woman, and a minority woman, and a woman who, thankfully, people say I look young for my age. At that time, I do think after I got my PhD, I've never worked in government again after getting my PhD. But I hate to say this because it's how the real world works, but I think people take me a little bit more seriously because I'm walking around Dr. Ron S.U. Ann Bowden instead of just Ron S.U. Ann Bowden. So that's the sad truth, that it may, in some cases, distinguish you, but I wouldn't then go to get a PhD because it was one of the hardest things I've done, and that's an opportunity cost. All those years that I was at Oxford by myself in the library, I could have been gaining other skills. I could have been in Washington, D.C. So, think carefully, show good judgment, and if it makes sense, because it's also a passion of yours, then that's going to help you with your career. So don't just do it for the title, but if you feel like it makes sense and you truly are interested in it, then I would say yes.
Yeah, and if I could add with that, I totally agree with that. I don't have a PhD. I'm thinking about getting one, but I think it really depends on what you really want to do and where your passion is. But the only thing the add is really when you're dealing with people from other countries, I do think the PhD matters more there actually than it does here in the United States.
That's true.
I saw a hand way in that corner, yes.
Whether the type of visa or whether having U.S. citizenship would matter a lot in the partnership?
Yes, in a healthy chunk of U.S. government work, if you're not a U.S. citizen, you will not get mentorship, I don't think. I don't know that, I know that for a fact in the Department of Defense. I don't know about the others, but I bet it's similar, right? Well, you don't ask if they're a citizen.
It depends. If it's anybody who's dealing with classified information, then you're likely not to even be considered. However, there are a lot of opportunities that are not in government that would be open to you. Be it in academia or NGOs, also a lot of international organizations, UN, any of those organizations, there are plenty of opportunities there. But for U.S. government, a little less likely.
Yeah.
Can I ask about sort of along similar lines? If you're a dual citizen, would that preclude you from certain positions?
It's my understanding, and I could be wrong, but it's my understanding that the United States only recognizes dual citizenship with Israel. So dual citizenship, do you mean that you're a U.S. citizen and you also have a passport from another country? That is not necessarily recognized as dual citizenship. Will that hurt you if you're trying to get a security clearance? You'll probably have to renounce the other citizenship. But in terms of internships, it may not. If it's with the U.S. government, you might have to fill out some disclosure forms, and that might affect it.
The bigger point is that if you can get a security clearance, that is a massive escalator, and if you cannot get one, it's going to be a ceiling very quickly on trying to do government work or government contract work. So that, and usually it's a weird, impossible thing to navigate. How do you get one of you? It's like, oh, I want the job so I can get experience. We're not going to hire anybody who doesn't have experience. So they only give clearances to people usually when you're already in a permanent position. They don't, because the organization has to pay for the extensive and expensive background investigation. So I don't know how it works at the internship phase, but if you can get yourself to having a U.S. government security clearance in any of the agencies that have them, that's going to open up more jobs.
I know at State they were beginning to give some interns a lower level clearance. So if you're at the State Department, that could affect that.
And the thing is, people like us, we're not in charge of the security clearance process. That's a totally separate thing done by the law enforcement and intelligence agencies. You still would need a basic level of security clearance at the State Department for an internship, and I actually did have a case where we had selected an intern, and it can be a very long process, and that person did not get a clearance, and so we were without an internship. I don't know what it was in their background, because I'm not privy to that kind of information, but we were just told that that security clearance wasn't going to come through. It does also just take a really long time. So while I've been here at UT, this is a couple years ago, there was a very good student at the LBJ school who had a great State Department internship lined up, but it was now like mid-May, and just because it takes so long and she had traveled overseas and lived overseas, she had the type of background you want, but it was just taking a long time. And I was working on a big consulting project and was actually looking for interns. And she said, my security clearance for the State Department may not be processed in time for me to start. And she said, well, could I intern with you? And I said, well, what happens if your clearance comes through? And she said, if it comes through, I will do that job like 40 hours a week during the weekday, and in the evenings and on the weekends, I will work on your project. And her security clearance came through, and she did work on our project and did a really good job. So, you know, the security, that's just kind of a story about how delayed the security clearance can take and how she was creative about making sure she had an internship for that summer.
So, if you have a secret or top secret security clearance, but it's not currently active, but the time hasn't run out on it yet, could that work to your advantage for an internship?
They can
Would it be
reactivate
easy
it.
to
That's just
reactivate it?
that's a very easy process compared to what we've been talking about before. They just have to reactivate its paperwork. It's not hard. So you already have a clearance, then that you don't have to say, well, I mean, they know it's inactive if you're applying for a job, you know. That's good. Sorry.
I've asked this question a lot of times, but no one's ever told me what a good GPA is. I hate to ask.
Depends on what the stack that people are looking at. That's the problem, right? I always want to say I do exactly what you do, and I think most people think we're looking for when you're just picking somebody, you're looking at the really, really, really great schools, and I mean usually the ones I'm looking at are definitely above 3.5.
Yes.
But I don't think anything above 3.85 to 4. I don't personally care anymore. If they're like 3.8, 3.9. I'm not the Rhodes application committee there. They really will be. Like, they're not going to look at anybody that's not already almost absolutely perfect. So there's diminishing returns at the end, right? It's not like, this one had a 4.0, this one had a 3.99. No one does that. But yeah, somewhere in, you know, basically A's and A minuses, I guess, for the vast majority of your college career.
I would agree. I think 3.5 is a good goal, or is a normal cutoff point, and I saw that kind of nice sigh of relief. That was cute. I can relate. It wasn't that long ago where I was like, wow, this class is really hard and this is going to pull down my GPA and I'm not going to make that cutoff for grad school or whatever. So I can relate.
But it's not the end of the world if you don't have a great GPA. It might be a little bit more challenging in a particular job or a pool, but you know, people are looking for you want to be well-rounded and find other ways to stand out, whether that's volunteers. Get good recommendations from your professors or from people that you've worked with. There are ways to round that up. I personally, my undergrad career was nothing to brag about. I had a horrible GPA, but I also had a job with the Foreign Relations Committee, which was probably related to my horrible GPA. But there are ways to get around it.
So is this referring to your cumulative GPA if you've been to multiple universities, or just your most recent GPA at your current university?
Usually you'll write somewhere on an application a number. What you write there is hopefully honest, because lying will absolutely ruin things, but that's all. No one gets into, we don't even, I don't think the majority of internships, people don't really get past asking about specific courses or like how you did in classes, except related to language. And there, you know, that might matter more. So it isn't really about that. But if you're a fabulous communicator, if your letter is incredibly well written, they've already made their decision on GPA, right? It's the only measures we have for how swift is this person, how quick, how much can they learn.
I think on a resume where you list each school you've gone to, it would be nice to then on that column say what the GPA at each school was. And I wanted to say, pick up on something Carolyn said. If you have other circumstances, like if her GPA wasn't stellar, but she was working at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, okay, working on that committee is like hitting a home run. That's a very interesting committee to work on. They don't hire just anybody. So I would still hire her because it's pretty obvious that she does amazing work. So if that type of thing is true for you, try to show that in your cover letter and your resume by like listing that and showing the dates clearly so that I can see, oh, this person worked 20 hours a week through their entire college career. That's pretty impressive. So that's something to keep in mind.
This man in the back there.
Sorry.
Sorry to see you.
I'm small, I'm back here. So from what you're saying, I guess my only real question is as far as transcript goes, because for example, the lady over there brought up having 2 different GPAs from 2 different schools and like having an accumulative GPA. Is there ever a point during like your the application like process that you guys go through where you guys nitpick at transcripts and class transfers or anything like that? Like,
I've never looked at a transcript when hiring an intern in my life. I've never asked for grades. That is completely foreign to me. So
Okay.
for me, no.
Same.
Yeah, same. I've never looked at a transcript. But you know, I think that the security clearance process and the way you apply for a U.S. government internship, you have to fill all that stuff in.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think somebody, not me, but somebody who does the security clearance and then somebody in human resources actually does make sure it all lines up correctly.
Yeah, again, your resumes are in front of people who are really busy and are going through a pretty tall stack. The last thing they're going to do is go line by line on your transcript. They can barely go line by line on your resume, so.
When you're in an internship, it's like pretty quickly you kind of get into a routine of doing the same things. And so how do you figure out ways to push beyond that and to show that you can do more than the tasks you're being given?
That's a great question. When I've had interns, actually, even if they have some set responsibilities, it was pretty rare that they ever had like the same week. And that was just kind of the nature of the work at the State Department that, for example, I remember, I was running a grant-making program, and on an annual basis, we would invite all of the NGOs getting grants to come and have a roundtable discussion where we would talk through some projects and some problems and try to come up with some principles, and so the organizations could cooperate. It was a really big production, and one of my interns happened to be there during that time, so he got thrown into everything. He was taking the notes, he was greeting people, he was doing coffee, and he got to do, like, he also got to engage with these people running interesting projects. So in my case, I've rarely had the same kind of work all the time, but I still remember he did an amazing job, and his sense of relief when we had successfully held the thing was almost as much as mine. And so I thought, wow, you really care about this stuff. There was a lot of buy-in. So I think just putting a lot into your work and wanting to excel at it, that comes through to people.
Yeah.
My colleagues might have better answers than that.
I would say the same thing. I mean, there are a couple of ways you can do that. I think, first of all, just being there. If somebody knows you're there, a lot of offices, the interns are hired by HR or an intern coordinator, and then you get introduced to this intern. But a lot of the policy folks and other people who you want to give you work, you're not really on their radar. They're busy. So I think part of it is being there, being physically present, making yourself known to them, but not in an annoying way. Another thing that can be done, as long as you are doing what is asked of you, you can also ask for a long-term project. Say, I'm here for the next 3 months. Is there a long-term, like an intern project, if you will? I've worked at organizations where, over the course of the internship, they would have to do a research project. So that's something that you can ask for. But I think one is just, what can I take off your plate? How can I be helpful to you? If you notice that they're doing a big event, say, okay, this event is coming up. I have these skills that I can apply to this event, that kind of thing. So, sometimes just offering to help, but not a broad, stupid question kind of offering to help. Narrow it, connect the dots for them so that they know how you can be helpful, instead of them having to be like, yeah, can you just fill up the water glasses? Let them know what skills that you do have and things that you can do.
Yeah, I'll echo that. One, ask for more work. Keep asking for more work until you have too much work. Then manage the lots of work you have and make clear to the people who now see you doing work all the damn time that you're trying really hard and you're being energetic. While you do that, stay curious. And that means try to learn actively. Everybody understands an intern is there to help, but also to learn. And so you have to seek or seize or create opportunities to say, I'm trying to understand what DRL does. What's this? How are these two things separate? Is there a time? It's not a bad idea to start with the low-level people, but ask for time for a coffee or a lunch so you can understand the organization better and just get advice. They all know they're supposed to do that. And if you say, sometime in the next month, you give them like a huge window, then you'll be able to gauge whether they have any interest or no. They're like, no, get away from me, right? So take those opportunities or create them and show that you're trying to learn about the organization, and then in fact, that can parlay into or grow into mentors.
Dr. Bowden, you mentioned you've worked in intelligence analysis. Do you have any advice for that type of work and skills that one would need?
That is a great question. And I will tell you, I don't think I was a great intelligence analyst. And first I'll tell you why. I was at the State Department. They have a small bureau for doing intelligence analysis. And it was early in my career, and I had no idea how Washington worked, how foreign policy was made. And the intelligence community was kind of separate from the other functions of the State Department. So we had no say in foreign policy. And in fact, one time, one thing I wrote vaguely could have been construed to be recommending a certain policy, and the editor said, we have to reword this because we never make policy recommendations. And I kind of thought to myself, I kind of want to have a hand in making foreign policy, so I wasn't a good fit for the IC, so I will say that. Honestly, a lot of the skills, if you love studying and being in school, you may love the IC, because I think you have to be very precise, you have to do a lot of research, you have to write a lot. But there are a lot of, and this wouldn't apply to every part of the intelligence community, but at least in the State Department, the intelligence analysts had pretty solitary lives. And I didn't really find that at that point in my career what I really wanted to do, so I would say the skills you're building now are really important if that's something you want to do. I would also say developing good judgment. So there was one time that it was in the afternoon, a little later in the day, and I saw one of my jobs was twice a week to bring some raw intelligence reports to the officers on the China desk, who there were about maybe 5 to 7 officers who worked on different things from economics to non-proliferation, but I literally would just bring them the papers. I didn't brief them, I just would have a stack of papers with me that seemed like the relevant things for them. But I always listened to their comments, because they were usually nice enough to comment or chat with me, and I kind of learned the issues that they cared about. So there was something that came in late in the day, and I could tell it was important. So I called them and said, something just came in, can I bring it up to you now? And I was right. I did show the right judgment because they were like, wow, like, thank you for bringing this. And I wouldn't have known that if I had, because it was kind of boring to bring the stack of papers and just sit there during, like, I think 30, 40 minutes while different people came in to read the things that were relevant to their portfolios. But paying attention and just being present and trying to be friendly so that they did talk to me, let me kind of read them a little more. And doing that later landed me, so actually, Aaron mentioned the Presidential Management Fellowship Program. I was actually a Presidential Management Fellow. My home bureau was the Bureau for Intelligence and Research, and I was allowed to do a couple of rotations, and because of that, the China desk said, hey, do you want to do one of your rotations here? And that was a really good step for my career, because then I did learn a little bit about how people make foreign policy and what that looked like.
The other thing I would say is read analysis now. I'm sure the library here has something that you can start reading and learning how they're written, and then kind of work backwards. Think about, well, if this is what the analysis is, think about what the raw data said or revealed. Locally, look into Stratfor. That might be something. I'm sure that they offer internships, but that would be, they are local and they're excellent. So I would definitely look into that.
You mentioned Stratfor. Are there any other private sector sorts of opportunities that are like, so there's Gov and there's NGOs. Are there any sorts of other groups like that you can, or is that like a popular thing?
Like, do the defense corporations have
Right.
interns? I'm sure they do.
Oh, yeah. Well,
I mean, there's huge private sector interests making zillions of dollars in Washington, D.C. off the government, and I'm sure they all take interns. So any big company that has big government contracts will probably have a D.C. office.
Yeah, I mean, there's advocacy. I worked for the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition for a while in D.C., and they advocated for a larger budget for international affairs programs. You also have all of the NGO contractors, so you have Chemonics, Creative Associates. There's a whole universe of those guys who get contracts and grants. International Republican Institute, National Democratic Institute. So there is that whole universe there.
I wanted to go back to one thing. Yes, read analysis, and this is touching on something pretty sensitive, but I personally will never look at WikiLeaks type of things. So even though it might be tempting to try to look at some things that have been leaked, I wouldn't recommend it. Who knows if it won't come up on your security clearance.
Oh yeah, that's not what I was talking about.
Yeah, I know that.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I see a lot of internship postings online specify for undergraduates who are juniors and seniors and already have some experience. What kind of advice do you have for the younger undergraduates so that they build those sorts of resumes that land the more high-level internships later in
Can I rephrase your question a little? I think the best way to ask this and maybe try to answer is what experience that you can get in 4 years of college is the best experience for, like, what types of experience would be attractive in internships and jobs, right?
Yeah, yes, sir.
And we've mentioned a few, study abroad, that's valuable. Language skills, however accomplished, will be of a great help to you. I had one that I wrote down I forgot to mention, which is if you have an opportunity to do something really hard, that becomes prestige in the DC community. So I don't think this is really possible in 4 years, but in your undergraduate years, but in the first few years when you're out of college, if you can go be an election observer someplace like really, really remote, and you spent just 2 months, but it was in southern Uganda doing something. These are things, really, it all comes down to something that's attractively interesting enough that people, when they read it in the cover letter, go, oh, you become, the guy who went to Uganda, right? So, in a way, it's whatever fashions a story that shows you're an interesting person. That's the best broad brush information. But in national security, there is this correlation to if you've spent some time in a dangerous place, safely, I hope, I'm not advising you to all go run off to South Sudan, that becomes useful for getting internships across government and certainly NGO. They want, oh, you've been out there. So that's where things like the Peace Corps, if you do that for a couple of years, that has a quick parlay into the good NGOs in DC. I mean, that's an escalator into that world. If you do USAID, if you go work in either through a church or a volunteer organization or just on your own volition and find a way to contribute to disaster relief or be involved in helping in a humanitarian situation, that is ooh, that person was interesting. That's my sense.
And you don't even have to do that abroad.
Right, that's true.
Hurricane Harvey is
Yes.
a perfect example of how you could volunteer and do meaningful work that is easily translated abroad. Advice I give a lot to young people who want to go into international affairs is get a skill. You have to be able to have some sort of real world application to all of this. And it sounded like your question was more, you're a freshman or a sophomore.
Yes,
and
exactly.
you're like, how do I get started in building the resume? Volunteering is definitely one way to do it. You can do local internships. Texas Public Policy Foundation, where I am now, they do part-time internships. We actually have a number of UT students that are there. And it's not they don't do foreign policy or international affairs, but they do economics. They do things that all have, that in many ways have foreign policy implications. But it's also an internship that you can point to as experience, and then you can also get recommendations from the people that you work with. So, start locally, and even the things that you were talking about, if your church does missions, things like that, volunteering, those are all resume builders.
Yeah, I would echo all of that. I had an intern who had worked, she was from Texas, and she had done volunteer or unpaid internship type work for organizations helping place refugees and help them assimilate. That to me made her stand out. I thought that was really interesting. Another even worked for a local NGO that worked on international adoption. So even if you're gonna stay local, because it's so expensive to be an unpaid intern in Washington, be creative. And then I also wanted to say, yeah, maybe in your earlier college years where it's harder to get interesting internships, that's the time to maybe study abroad. And studying abroad conveys many different things. One, you are getting language skills, but it conveys to me when I'm looking at an application, this person is interesting, this person is flexible, this person is adventurous, this person, this sounds silly, but this person can take care of themselves in a foreign country and not get into trouble, or, they're responsible. So that's one reason why it's important. And then, yes, it gives you an understanding of that country and geopolitics and all kinds of wonderful issues.
And just one example of what you're saying, because I completely agree with that, is a lot of places you can teach abroad for the summer. That's a good way to do that.
Would you say that some degrees or some majors are more competitive than others?
Some degrees are more competitive than others.
The normal.
If you have a fine arts degree, it's not as applicable. So again, as I was saying earlier, there are different types. If you have a communications degree, you can still go into foreign relations or national security, but you might be a spokesperson, kind of. That would be your track. You could also change from that track too. But you do want to be strategic about it and go on, forge that path that you want to end, where you want to end. But that's not to say that you might change your mind. That happens all the time. But I think it ultimately depends on what it is that you want to do and what that strategy is.
Pursuing scholarship you're interested in is better than any trying to match it to a certain degree, because if you do care about it, you'll be better at it. It'll reflect. It'll be obvious. It becomes immediately transparent. If you care about what you do, and the opposite is true.
this will be our last question, by the way, but we'll have,
Could we just take like 3 or 4 and then just answer
Okay,
them
yeah,
all in
yeah,
one
that
round?
sounds great.
I hate to
Yeah,
leave
don't do-
anyone out.
I can pass, because I've already asked.
Go ahead, we'll just take it in.
Last few questions.
So, on the note of degrees and recording, I guess, experience that you've had, if you've had, say, military training that's not going to show up on your college transcript, but you feel like might have contributed to like your managerial skills or your ability to respond in harsh conditions, how, I guess, would you communicate that in a way that doesn't seem irrelevant?
On your, any resume should have, oh, sorry, we're taking more than one. But any resume should have your previous employment. But, well, let's take all the questions.
You spoke about the sort of gender imbalances, which is any advice on, I hate asking this question, but like, as a woman, how do you make it in the male-dominated world of government and national security?
Why don't I take hers and defer on the other one to you, right? So for military stuff, if you were in the military, it should of course be on your resume. If you did something like, you know, a military program but that did not result in actual employment in the military, I don't think you might try to mention it in your story, but I don't think that's terribly useful.
Like specialty schools type things?
You mean like military schools?
Yeah.
For high school?
No, like, you know, like airborne.
Oh, yeah. If you have military experience, there should be a little section in your resume. What you did in the military, how long you were in, and what schools you went to, even though if they were 2-week military schools. That's true.
And you can even create a section in your resume that's like other skills or training, that kind of thing. Do you want to go first?
Very good question. Are you going to say something positive?
Neutral?
Okay.
I already went negative at the opening. I'm like, it's not fair, so let's get better as we go, I guess.
This is a better conversation to have when I have something stronger than water. You know, I think I had a good career. I still am very happy with my career in government, outside government, as an academic. But I personally think it is harder in some ways. When I was at the State Department, I did sometimes think it was hard to get taken seriously, and often we had some pretty intense negotiations within the State Department about, are we allowed to say this on China? Are we allowed to say that? Which prisoner are we going to advocate for? And so I had to learn to assert myself, and I think it was hard. I also found that even, not so much the people I worked with during those negotiations, maybe it was my counterpart. When I was in the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, I had a counterpart on like the China desk or North Korea desk, and those were actually my most bitter negotiations. Like we would like, I sometimes was about to like lose my cool, but I learned to just be very professional, very insistent, and to argue well. And with them, I don't think it mattered, but I will be honest that sometimes I would walk through the State Department and I would get a few comments like, nice dress. Like, that's just not professional. So I actually learned that when I walked into the State Department door, and I also grew up in Hawaii, and so people there are kind of friendly. I was young looking, I tended to smile. I taught myself actually when I walked through the front door, I put on a scowl. And my husband hates me saying this type of thing because he thinks it's discouraging. I made myself look really stern. I also always dressed as professionally as possible. Suit, professional dress, pantyhose, all of that. I'm sorry, it matters. And when, actually, so I met my husband at work. We were both working at the State Department, and when he first saw me, he said to himself, what is that? Because I think she's kind of attractive, but she looks really, really stern. And I'm actually happy about that, because that's kind of and it was exhausting for me, because I kind of had to put on a slightly different persona. Now, I could still bring the empathy I felt for those issues to my work, but I did have to my demeanor changed a little bit. Now that I'm in academia, I find that I'm able to be a little more relaxed and still be taken seriously, but I think Washington was a little hard. And I was also younger then, you know, I think it's hard getting started and being taken seriously, so.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo a lot of that. I would say that I had a slightly different experience, particularly with clothes. They do matter. I always made a point of dressing extremely professionally. I'm also short, so I wore heels. And I love heels. I like shoes. Comments were made about my having the best shoes in the State Department. I've also had men who were intimidated by the shoes. So I think number one, be excellent, work hard, put the hours in. I mean, when I was in policy planning, I was always there were two of us who were always the last people there, and we were both women. Be assertive. Don't be afraid to fight for things such as parking, because it's easy for them to. It matters. It's a matter of respect. If it's something that they're going to give a male colleague of the same rank, then you should fight for it. But at the same time, don't be afraid to be a woman. I mean, it's who I am. As I said, I enjoy clothes and shoes, and I'll have fun with it. But also have a sense of humor. I'm a pretty smiley person. I bake things, bring them into the office, so I have that side of me. But I'm also not afraid to fight back. I'm not afraid to get into it with words, and I think you just can't hold grudges. You can't let it get to you, and you can't have it become a chip on your shoulder. You just have to keep going, and in the end, I think earlier in my career, I definitely felt like people treated me like a little kid, partly because I looked like a little kid. But again, that's when I learned I had to be assertive. I had to say what was on my mind, and to fight for things like parking, and it matters.
Yeah, so I was in my last job at the State Department in the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. I had a pretty good portfolio, a lot of responsibility. I had an office where I had a view of the Potomac. And you know, this is what I think just so you know what you may be up against. One of the men he was actually a man and he was a minority. He was in charge of like furniture and allotment of spaces, and he walked by with his assistant and said, "Mark, this one is vacant." And I'm like, wait, why are you saying my office is vacant? He's like, "Because you're just an intern, you're just temporary here, they just put you in here." And I was like, and I kind of stood up, and I'm, not big, and I said, "I am not an intern." Now, there's nothing wrong with being an intern, but I actually was pretty mad. I said, "I am not an intern. Why did you assume that?" And then I just kind of turned around and started working at my desk again. And the next day or a couple hours later, he came by and actually apologized for assuming that. So, that is some of what you may face. And I do think the dressing well professionally, and also, the high heels, that's all gonna help you.
I can give you two like, for men and women, two things that you would be probably well to avoid, which is common in young people, and it's sort of effectively your Achilles heel. It's what we expect to go wrong, so don't let this go wrong, okay? So with interns and people your age, number one, which has already came up in this in several different ways, is your inability to problem solve. So when we say do X, and then you come back and go like, how do I do X? Or where do you keep the ice? In the freezer, right? So there's a good book on this called Message to Garcia, maybe read it, but it's a key component in any kind of career field of can you problem solve into solutions, ask for guidance when you need it, but seize the initiative and make decisions. So if you keep coming back and asking questions that we're like, really, where's the ice? That's your question. You've lost it. The second one that's sort of related to that, I guess, is you do want to channel ambition, and one way to show ambition but also not get sucked into us losing respect for you or credibility in you is if you are, I just lost my train of thought. Hold on, I'll find it again now. Here it is. If something goes wrong, then to whatever degree there is a way that you can seize responsibility for that. Even if it's a little bit like it definitely wasn't your fault, but you're like, I guess I should have thought of this in advance. The more you seem to be showing that you're seizing the responsibility for when things go wrong, the more people will have faith in you. The minute you say, it's not my fault in one way or another, if you literally say those words, it's not my fault, you're in real trouble. But if you just offer up like, well, then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened, nobody cares about why. So if you can embrace that spirit of like trying to seize the responsibility and claim the responsibility for things, seize the initiative, that will help you avoid, and regardless of your gender and the challenges of dealing with other human beings in Washington, D.C., some of whom are not great with people, that will be a great like thing that will help.
Yeah, and I just want to add something to the dressing professionally. Dressing professionally is also dressing appropriately. You know, if you have questions about what is professional, think appropriate. What is appropriate for the job that I'm doing? If you are expected to do IT work and help with computers, and you know you're going to be crawling under a desk and you're a woman, don't wear a short skirt. So it really is dress appropriately. One other thing I would add, and this is for both men and women, but I think it also matters. Women don't think about this as much. Have a firm handshake. Don't kind of offer that limp hand of I'm going to take whatever you give me, or I'm not going to fight. You know, have a good firm handshake.
Well, let's thank our panelists for their excellent address.